didn't say a word. I just stood there, in the doorway of my own dining room, holding a bowl of scalloped potatoes I'd spent 40 minutes making from scratch, while my son-in-law looked up from the head of my table, the one Harold and I bought at an estate sale in Stratford back in 1987, and said, "We've already started. You can leave that on the counter." Not thank you, not pull up a chair, not even a glance at the potatoes. Leave that on the counter. I was 67 years old, standing in my own home in Kitchener, Ontario, and I had just been dismissed like a delivery driver. I didn't cry that night. I didn't raise my voice. I set the bowl down on the counter exactly as he told me to, walked upstairs to what used to be my bedroom. The guest room, I had to remind myself, because somewhere along the way, it had become the guest room, and I sat on the edge of the bed with my hands folded in my lap, and I thought about every single moment that had led me to that point. Every time I told myself it wasn't that bad, every time I said, "They're just going through a rough patch," every time I smiled and swallowed it down. There were a lot of those times. Let me go back to the beginning. Because if I start from that dinner, you won't understand how a woman who taught school for 31 years, who raised her daughter largely on her own after Harold got sick, who has never once in her life let anyone speak to her badly, you won't understand how a woman like me ended up sleeping in the guest room of her own house. Harold passed in the spring of 2019, pancreatic cancer. We had 8 months from diagnosis to the end, and I am grateful, truly, that we had that time, because some people don't. We said everything we needed to say. He made me promise not to let the house get too quiet. He meant that I should have people around. He meant that I should have people around. He meant that I should live. I think about that promise a lot now. The house is a detached 2-story on a quiet street near Victoria Park. Harold and I bought it in 1994, raised our daughter Pauline there, watched her grow up in that backyard. The willow tree by the fence. Harold planted it the year Pauline was born. He said a weeping willow for a daughter was bad luck, and I said that was nonsense, and we planted it anyway. And it grew taller than the roofline, and Pauline used to hide in its curtain of branches when she was small. After Harold died, I stayed in the house. My pension from the school board plus Harold's life insurance left me comfortable. Not wealthy, but I didn't need to worry about the furnace or the roof or whether I could afford a winter coat. I had good neighbors. I had my book club on Thursday evenings. I had a life. Pauline called me in October of 2021. She'd been living in Calgary with her husband for 3 years by then. His name is, well, I'll call him my son-in-law, because that's all he ever was to me, even at the best of times. They'd met through friends, married quickly, and I told myself I was just being a protective mother when I felt uneasy. He was the kind of man who spoke before you finished your sentence, who never quite looked at you directly. Pauline called him charming. I called him slippery, but only to myself. That October call, Pauline told me his contracting business in Calgary had collapsed. Not failed, slowly collapsed. A project went sideways. There were legal disputes with the subcontractor. Money they'd borrowed against their condo to fund the business was now unrecoverable. They were, in Pauline's words, in a really tight spot. "We just need a few months, Mum," she said. "Just until Declan sorts things out." Declan. That was his name. Declan. "Of course," I said. "Come home." What else would I say? She was my daughter. They arrived in November with 2 SUV loads of belongings and a Yorkshire Terrier named Biscuit, who immediately urinated on the corner of my good wool rug in the front hall. That should have been a sign. I gave them the master bedroom. I know, I know. People say that's where it all begins. And they are right. But at the time it seemed practical. The room was large, it had an ensuite, and I thought, they need space. They're a couple, it's the right thing to do. I moved my things into the second bedroom, the one with the smaller closet and the window that rattles when the wind comes from the north. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that a lot. The first few weeks were fine, or fine enough. Pauline helped with dinners. Declan was out during the day, supposedly meeting people, making calls, piecing together whatever was left of his professional reputation. I stayed out of their way. I made room. Then, slowly, things began to shift. It started with the kitchen. I came downstairs one Saturday in December to find that Declan had reorganized the cupboards. My everyday dishes, the blue and white set Harold and I had picked up at a flea market in Elora years ago, were in a box on the laundry room floor. In their place, stacked neatly, was a set of matte black plates I had never seen before. Declan thought the kitchen flow was off, Pauline said when I asked. She was making coffee and not looking at me. Kitchen flow. I took a breath. I put the blue dishes back myself that afternoon while Declan was out. He didn't say anything about it when he came home. But he didn't have to. Pauline came to find me that evening and said, "Mom, can you just try to be flexible? We're all adjusting." I was 67 years old in my own house, and I was being asked to be flexible. I picked my battles. That was my mistake. I kept thinking if I just stayed calm, kept the peace, it would smooth itself out. I'd been a teacher for 31 years. I knew how to manage difficult situations without escalating. What I didn't account for was that some situations aren't meant to be managed. Some situations are meant to be ended. In January, Declan mentioned that a friend of his needed a place to stay for a couple of weeks. His friend Nate, apparently between apartments. In my house? I said. Just the basement, Declan said. He's very clean. I don't know this man. I know him, though. He said it as if that settled it. I said no. That was one of the times I said no clearly, and Declan looked at me with an expression I can only describe as mildly inconvenienced, the way someone looks when the Tim Hortons line is longer than expected. He said, "Okay, fair enough," and that was that. But it wasn't that, because the following weekend, Nate arrived with a duffel bag and set himself up in my basement for 6 days. Declan never mentioned it. I found out when I went downstairs to check the water heater and found a stranger asleep on my fold-out couch. I went upstairs and told Declan that his friend needed to leave by Sunday. Declan said, "Yeah, for sure, we were just trying to do the guy a favor." We, as if it were his house to offer favors from. Nate left on Sunday, but something had settled into the air of the house after that, something I couldn't quite name, a kind of ownership that didn't belong there. I kept a notebook on this, pale green, coil-bound. I bought it at Staples. I started writing things down in February because I had a feeling, a teacher's instinct really, that I would need to remember the sequence of events. What happened first, then next, then next. So I wrote it all down. The dishes, the friend in the basement, the grocery money. That one needs explaining. In February, I told Pauline that I was happy to contribute to the household groceries, but that I wanted to keep a shared list and divide costs fairly once they were back on their feet. She agreed. What I didn't know was that Declan had somehow gotten hold of my grocery delivery account. Pauline must have told him the login, and for 2 months he had been adding items I hadn't selected. Protein powders. cases of craft beer, a $90 cast iron pan ordered to my address, charged to my account, currently sitting in my kitchen cupboard. When I looked at the account history, I counted $1,340 in charges over 8 weeks that I hadn't made. I showed Pauline. She looked at the screen for a long time and then said, "He probably just thought it was shared." "It wasn't shared, Pauline. He knew my password because you gave it to him." "I'm sorry, Mom, I'll talk to him." She did talk to him. She said he'd pay me back. He didn't. I wrote it down in the green notebook. Spring came. I won't say things got better because they didn't, but they found a kind of rhythm that I mistook for stability. Declan had picked up some small renovation contracts locally, word of mouth, cash jobs mostly, and he seemed, if not cheerful, at least less present in the house during the day. Pauline was working remotely for a firm in Calgary, sitting at my dining room table for 8 hours a day with her laptop and her noise-canceling headphones. I worked around her. In April, I came home from my Thursday book club to find that the photograph of Harold and me from our anniversary trip to Cape Breton, framed in driftwood, hung in the front hallway for 20 years, had been moved to a shelf in the laundry room. In its place on the wall was a large canvas print of a mountain lake. Generic, the kind of thing you'd see in a hotel lobby. Declan had apparently bought it at a home decor shop on King Street. I stood in the hallway for a long time. Then I picked up the mountain lake and put it in the garage. I rehung Harold's photo myself. My hands were shaking a little, but I got it level. Declan didn't speak to me for 3 days after that. I genuinely do not think he realized how little that bothered me. But here is the thing about tolerance. It is not infinite. It stretches and stretches, and you tell yourself it's resilience, it's love, it's the right thing to do. And then one day you reach the end of it. Not with a bang, usually, with something small. Something that shouldn't matter but somehow contains every single thing that came before it. For me, it was the willow tree. It was a Thursday in late May. I came home from running errands to find Declan in the backyard with a man I didn't recognize. And Harold's willow, Pauline's willow, the one we planted the year she was born, had been cut down to a stump. Declan was having a patio put in. He'd hired someone. He'd made a plan, got a quote, scheduled a crew without asking me a single word about it, and they had cut down a tree that Harold planted 28 years ago. I walked across the yard. I was very calm. I am always very calm when I am most serious. "What happened to my tree?" I said. Declan looked up. It was blocking the space for the patio. "It was getting too big anyway. That tree was planted by my husband." "I know, and look, I should have mentioned it, but honestly it had to come down eventually. I'm actually improving the property value here." I looked at the stump. I thought about Harold. I thought about Pauline as a little girl disappearing into those branches. I went inside. I sat at the kitchen table. I called my sister in London, Ontario, and I told her what had just happened, and she said, "Bev, that's enough." And she was right. I didn't do anything that day. I am methodical by nature. If you teach elementary school for 3 decades, you learn that reaction without planning rarely accomplishes what you want. So I gave myself the weekend. I thought carefully. I called my sister again. I called my friend Rosemary, who had been through something similar with a tenant. And on Monday morning, I called a lawyer. The lawyer's name was Patricia Owusu, and she was efficient and direct, and she confirmed several things I needed to hear. The unauthorized use of my payment account was a matter of financial fraud. The modification of my property, cutting down a tree, making structural plans for my backyard without my consent, was a legal issue. And because Declan and Pauline had no formal tenancy agreement, I had the right to ask them to leave with reasonable notice under Ontario's residential tenancy framework, which in the shared dwelling situation with the homeowner was considerably simpler than many people assumed. I asked about the money, the $340 in grocery charges, the $160 over 3 months I'd found in my visa records, charges to services I didn't recognize, the $500 cash I had given Pauline in December for incidentals that I suspected had not been used for incidentals that I suspected had not been used for incidentals. Ms. Awusu said it was worth documenting everything carefully. I told her I already had a green notebook. She told me to keep it. That Friday, I waited until Declan left for a job site. Then I sat down with Pauline at the kitchen table. I made 2 cups of tea. I put one in front of her, then I put the notebook on the table between us, and I said, I need to talk to you about some things. I watched her face while I spoke. She started with denial. Declan wouldn't do that. I'm sure there's an explanation. And then moved to justification. And then, finally, to something that looked like shame. Not surprise, shame. Which told me she knew more than she'd admitted. I said, I'm not angry with you, Pauline. I love you. But this has to end. I told her I needed them to be out within 30 days. I had it in writing. I had already spoken to a lawyer, and if the money wasn't repaid, I would be pursuing it formally. She cried. I let her. I poured more tea. What happened next is that Declan came home early that afternoon and was considerably less willing to respond with tears. He raised his voice. He told me I was being unreasonable. He said I had invited them into the situation and couldn't just change the rules. I said, very calmly, these were always the rules, you just ignored them. He told me that what I was doing was cruel to my own daughter. He told me I would regret it. He stood in my kitchen, in my house, and he told me what I would regret. I said, you have 30 days. I'd suggest you use them well. And I walked upstairs. They did not leave quietly. There were slammed doors and tense evenings, and one night I heard them arguing through the wall until past midnight. I wore earplugs and read a library book, and I slept fine. They left in 22 days, not 30. Declan had found them a rental in Waterloo, a 1-bedroom which I thought spoke for itself in terms of financial reality. On the day they left, Pauline hugged me at the door. Declan loaded the SUV without speaking to me. Biscuit urinated on the front hall rug one final time as if in tribute. The lawyer proceeded with the formal notice of claim for the unauthorized charges. Declan ignored the first letter. He did not ignore the second, which came from Mrs. Inningu, Awusu's office, with considerably more specific language about the documented history, the account access, and the property modification. We settled out of court for $1,100, which didn't cover everything but covered enough to feel like something. The patio never got built, obviously. The stump was still in the backyard. In September, I hired a small landscape company to remove the stump and reseed the lawn. I planted a Japanese maple where the willow had stood. It's small right now, barely knee-height, but maples are patient things. They take their time. Pauline and I still talk. It's not the same as it was, but it's not nothing either. She left Declan 8 months after they moved out. She didn't tell me why. Not exactly, but she didn't have to. I know what it's like to live with a man who rearranges your world and calls it an improvement. She's renting a place in Hamilton now. She comes to Kitchener for Sunday dinners sometimes. She never mentions Declan. I never bring him up. The dining room table is mine again. The blue dishes are back where they belong. Harold's photo is in the front hallway where it has always been. In the driftwood frame, and he is smiling at me the way he always did, like I just said something that surprised him in the best possible way. I sit in my kitchen in the evenings with a cup of tea and I listen to the house. It's quiet, but it's a different kind of quiet than when Harold first died. That was an absence. This is a peace. I think he would understand the difference. I think he'd say I kept my promise. Not the way he meant it, not by filling the house with people, but in the way that actually matters. I stayed here. I held on to what was ours. I didn't let anyone make me a guest in my own life. That, I think, is what he meant all along.